They thought I was powerless the moment my access badge stopped working. The soft red light blinking back at me like a verdict I hadn't been allowed to argue. It was 8:57 a.m., 3 minutes before the executive floor filled up, and I stood there holding my coffee, staring at a door I had walked through every weekday for almost 7 years. Security didn't rush me. No one needed to. The message had already been sent. When the system denies you silently, it's because the decision was made loudly somewhere else. I knew something was wrong the night before. You develop instincts when you work close to power. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, almost boring awareness that something is shifting under your feet. Emails stop coming. Meetings you were copied on for years suddenly exclude you. A calendar invite disappears without explanation. People stop making eye contact in the hallway, not because they hate you, but because fear teaches obedience faster than loyalty ever could. My name is Elena Wright, and until that morning, I was the senior compliance director for a multinational energy conglomerate that publicly preached transparency, while privately weaponizing complexity. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud. I wasn't one of the executives who enjoyed panel discussions and magazine profiles. I was the person who read footnotes, cross-checked signatures, and asked questions that made rooms uncomfortable. That's exactly why they hired me, and exactly why they decided I had become a problem. When the badge failed a second time, a young security guard I barely recognized cleared his throat and said, my name like it physically hurt him. He told me there had been a temporary system update, and that HR would contact me shortly. That's corporate language for go home quietly and don't make a scene. I smiled, thanked him, and walked back to my car. Every step measured, controlled, and calm. Panic would come later. Right now, I needed clarity. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone had already started filling with automated notifications. Access to internal systems revoked. Company email disabled. Calendar permissions removed. It was clean, efficient, almost elegant in how thoroughly they erased me. They thought this was the end of my involvement. They believed that once the door closed, whatever I knew would die in silence with my career. They were wrong. 2 months earlier, I had been assigned to oversee an internal review tied to a series of cross-border asset transfers. On paper, everything looked routine. Subsidiaries restructuring, intellectual property moving between jurisdictions, tax efficiencies optimized. It was the kind of work executives loved to bury under jargon, because it discouraged curiosity. But something didn't sit right with me. The signatures repeated in patterns that didn't align with the authority matrix. Approval timestamps clustered too neatly around reporting deadlines. And one document, just one, referenced a licensing agreement that didn't officially exist. I did what I had always done. I didn't accuse. I didn't escalate emotionally. I verified. Quietly, I pulled archived agreements. I cross-referenced board minutes. I reconstructed decision trails. What I found wasn't a mistake. It was architecture. A deliberately layered structure designed to move ownership of critical patents through shell entities, temporarily off the books, then reintroduce them at a dramatically inflated valuation. On its own, that would have been aggressive but survivable. What made it explosive was who benefited. The final ownership trail led not to the corporation, but to a private holding group tied directly to 3 sitting board members. They weren't skimming. They weren't stealing in the way people expect. They were rewriting reality, shifting billions in asset value through legal shadows, and positioning themselves to personally control what the market believed belonged to shareholders. I documented everything. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted recognition. But because my entire career had been built on one unglamorous principle. If something can be proven, it matters. I created mirrored backups, encrypted drives, and off-network archives. I timestamped every file. I logged every access. I even documented my own activity, because I knew how this story usually ended. The person who speaks first is rarely the one who survives. When I requested a formal review meeting, it was postponed, then rescheduled, then quietly cancelled. Instead, I was invited to a strategic alignment discussion with two executives who had never once asked my opinion before. They smiled too much. They complimented my dedication. They asked vague questions about my long-term goals. One of them suggested I might be burning out and offered a generous sabbatical. That was when I knew they had seen the outline of what I'd uncovered. Even if they didn't yet understand its full shape, I declined the sabbatical. The next week, my direct supervisor stopped returning messages. The week after that, legal asked me to hand over all working documents for consolidation. I complied, but only with copies. Originals stayed where they had always been, outside their reach, waiting. So when I sat in my car that morning, locked out of the building, watching employees I had trained walk past me without looking up, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared. What I didn't expect was how calm I felt. There is a strange peace that comes when the worst thing you imagined finally happens. Fear has nothing left to threaten you with. At 10:14 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. At 10:17, an email arrived in my personal inbox from a private legal firm I recognized immediately. Not one associated with my company. One associated with regulatory oversight and shareholder litigation. They didn't threaten me. They didn't promise anything. They asked one sentence. Are you willing to authenticate the materials you submitted anonymously last month? I sat back and laughed, a sound that surprised even me, because that was the part they never saw coming. I hadn't waited until I was fired. I hadn't tried to negotiate safety. I had already done what needed to be done, quietly, methodically, and without asking permission. The signature they thought would end my relevance was about to do the opposite. By noon, emergency board meetings were being called. By early afternoon, trading desks were asking questions no one wanted to answer. And by the time the market closed, a single disclosure request had set off a valuation reassessment that no public relations strategy could contain. They thought locking me out of the office would end the story. It was only the first line. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, the building I'd been locked out of was louder than it had ever been when I worked inside it. Phones rang without pause. Legal teams rotated in and out of conference rooms. Assistants whispered in corners, refreshing news feeds that were updating faster than internal memos could keep up. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I'd spent enough years inside the ecosystem to recognize the pattern of controlled panic. At 6:42 p.m., the first headline hit a financial wire service. It was carefully worded, almost polite, but devastating if you understood what it meant. Energy firm faces regulatory inquiry over asset valuation practices. No accusations yet, no names. Just enough uncertainty to make investors nervous. Stock prices don't need guilt to fall. They only need doubt. I made dinner that night like nothing unusual had happened. Pasta, a simple salad, a glass of water. My hands didn't shake. My appetite didn't disappear. That surprised me more than the news itself. For years, my body had lived in a constant state of low-grade stress, the kind that feels normal until it's gone. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, I realized how heavy that weight had been. At 9:11 p.m., my phone rang again. Different number. This time I answered. The man on the other end introduced himself calmly, professionally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flatter me. He didn't threaten me. He explained that a multi-agency task force had been formed to review the materials connected to the inquiry, and my documentation had become central to understanding the scope of what was unfolding. He asked if I would be willing to provide sworn testimony and technical clarification over the coming weeks. I told him yes. Not because I wanted justice in some cinematic sense. Not because I wanted my former colleagues punished. But because the truth, once exposed, has a way of demanding completion. You can't half-finish a collapse. Structures either stand or they fall. The next morning, markets opened in a different mood. Analysts began revising outlooks. Commentators speculated about leadership shakeups. An internal memo leaked. Then another. By lunchtime, the company's valuation had taken a hit large enough to wipe out months of growth. Still, the real damage hadn't surfaced yet. That kind of destruction doesn't come from headlines. It comes from confirmations. 3 days later, a mandatory disclosure revealed what the initial review had uncovered. The intellectual property transfers. The temporary off-book entities. The private holding structures tied to board members. What had once been abstract suddenly became personal. Names appeared. Dates aligned. Shareholders realized that billions in perceived value had been artificially constructed, then quietly redirected. That was when the number everyone remembers entered the conversation. Overnight, analysts recalculated the company's true asset position. When the dust settled, the market correction was brutal and precise. A single sequence of transactions, once exposed, triggered a chain reaction that erased confidence across multiple divisions. By the end of that week, the firm's market capitalization reflected a $5 billion discrepancy between what had been reported and what actually existed. $5 billion. Not stolen in the traditional sense. Not missing. But never truly there to begin with. Executives resigned for personal reasons. Board members stepped aside pending investigation. Press statements promised cooperation and transparency. Words that sounded hollow now that everyone knew how selectively those values had been applied. And quietly, without ceremony, my name began circulating in rooms I had never been invited into before. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post anything online. I didn't give interviews. Power doesn't need witnesses to exist. It only needs leverage. And for the first time in my career, the leverage wasn't held by the people with the biggest offices. 2 weeks after I was locked out, I received an official letter. It wasn't an apology. Corporations rarely apologize in ways that matter. It was an acknowledgement, a formal recognition that my termination had been procedurally flawed, and that my findings had been substantively validated. They offered a settlement, a generous one, enough to disappear comfortably. I declined, because something else had already taken shape in the vacuum they'd created. Regulators needed people who understood the machinery from the inside. Investors needed independent oversight. Advisory boards wanted voices that hadn't been trained to look away. Quietly, without announcements, I began consulting. Not for prestige, not for revenge, but because systems only change when people who know where the cracks are refuse to ignore them. Months later, I walked past the same building I'd once been barred from entering. New logos. New leadership. Same address. It felt smaller now. Less imposing. Power always does once you've seen behind the curtain. They thought locking me out would make me irrelevant. They assumed isolation meant silence. What they never understood was that my authority had never come from a badge, a title, or an office on the executive floor. It came from understanding how the game was played, and choosing not to play it their way. When the story is told later, people will say the company collapsed because of one investigation, one disclosure, one market correction. But the truth is simpler and harder to accept. It collapsed because someone they underestimated decided that the truth was worth more than their approval. And once that decision was made, everything else was inevitable.